Hello and welcome to another episode of the TF Cast.
Today with us, we have Dustin Swiers from the Mankato Makerspace. He's the director over there. He's going to talk about some of the programming, the upcoming Makers Market, and your own practices. For any of our guests who might not know, could you introduce conceptually what is the Makers Market and tell them a little bit about the Makerspace itself?
Thanks for having me here. The market this Sunday, the 23rd, is a opportunity for artists, craftspeople, makers of all kinds to network, sell their wares, all kinds of things that they might make, craft, whether it's music, food, or art. They will have the opportunity to reach out to the community, have conversations, make connections, as well as make a little money.
Mm-hmm. And do people who are participating in the market as vendors, are they all related to the Makerspace otherwise? They're members or?
A lot of them are members of the Makerspace, and if you are a member, you get to vend for free with us. It's a little perk of being a member. But there are vendors outside of the Makerspace community that participate. They're local. Some come a little farther out of town. So there is a large variety of types of things and people.
Cool. And if someone was just coming into the Makers Market, like what kind of things would they most likely encounter at these vendor locations?
There can be anything from two-dimensional to three-dimensional work, like knitting, crochet, painting, ceramics. There will be food, music. There might be instruments being made and sold, plants, things that are grown from the garden, herbs, spices, farm to table, those kinds of things. You name it.
That sounds like a whole lot.
Mm-hmm.
Is this will be taking place at the Mankato Makerspace?
Correct.
Okay.
We are at 1700 Pine. That is off of 3rd Avenue, just going north out of town right before the train tracks. It's a Goodrich construction building. Can't miss it. It is that brick, glazed brick building. It's orange. And there will be vendors outside and inside the market. The Makerspace will have both doors open so people can walk through the shop and see the different things, the departments. There will be demonstrations there, and you will see all the different vendors around the outside of the building.
Oh, that sounds cool. Yeah. For someone who might not know anything about the Makerspace, what kind of experience does someone going in there for the first time get? What do your clients do there, and what do you offer?
So the Makerspace is a nonprofit organization that is still 100% volunteer run, and members will come in for a variety of different things, primarily education, whether they're trying to better their craft, learn a new trade or hobby. Some will come in for the access of tools and equipment. Not everybody can fit a table saw in the middle of their living room, so we've got equipment set up and ready to use. Also, professionals will come in that are already skilled and have both of those types of things, and they just need the space that those things can occupy. So you can come in and turn some wood down into a lamp or a pedestal and throw shavings all over the floor and not worry about making a mess and clean up after yourself when you're done. So those types of things. So it's education, tools, and the space that they occupy. And as far as the members, how they utilize the space is also pretty diverse. I had mentioned a little bit about entrepreneurship. People that run their own small businesses or artists will come in and use the Makerspace in that capacity. Also, if you just need something fixed, if you need a hand repairing something or you need hands with a project, we are very much a community. And it is a valued piece of being a Makerspace member is that networking aspect, or like I said, just simply having someone to help you work on something. Can bounce ideas off of each other, critique, exploration into new materials, media. So it's always a valuable thing having conversations with a lot of the experts that are there that can just kind of point you in the right direction or save you a couple of fumbling steps throughout your making.
Yeah, I'm sure that most people who create things can identify with coming across a roadblock that would be really great to have some support with.
Yeah, for sure.
It's really cool that you offer that. Our one of our previous guests, Justin Burgo, was a member and a contributing. I don't know if we want to talk at all about that, but we talked a lot about the makerspace and kind of what he does there, making frames.
Yeah.
Which is pretty neat, and he learned that from someone who was there, kind of taught him and showed him how.
Yeah, it almost seemed as it. I mean, the way he told the story, he's like, "Oh, and then I was encouraged. I was like, no, do it today. Find the next thing." Yeah. So, you mentioned that community is a big part of the practice there, but I mean, it's a nonprofit business as well, or I don't know if business is the right way to do that. Is it part of a group of others, or what is it modeled after? It's kind of this big giant undertaking to make all these tools available. But what's kind of the ethos behind it, or what's it modeled after? How did we come into this position of having this asset to the community?
The makerspace was originally created for the individuals that were struggling with those particular needs that I talked that the makerspace offers as individuals, artists, tinkerers, craftspeople. And renting studio space was a bit out of their possibilities. And with a lot of craft, having a single studio space sometimes isn't enough. The different mediums that I work in, it is so much more effective having those tools set up and ready to go so that I can make those. Say I just need to make a cut real quick, and if I had it in my garage, I'd have to set up the chop saw, pull out some sawhorses, extension cords. It'd take me an hour to set up, we'll say, and make a cut. It takes 2 seconds, and then I have to clean up and put it all back away. So we were having some of these problems, and we came together as individuals to create this art collective. The Minnesota Makers and Artists Guild is the governing body of the Mankato Makerspace. So that collective of individuals started brainstorming the possibilities of a community studio. And at first it was meant to be something utilized by that first collective of individuals. But we quickly came to understand that we were not alone, and there was a demand in Mankato for a community shop, and it continues to evolve and expand to now anyone and everyone is welcome, and there are classes being taught, all different demographics and age ranges, experience levels, people trying a material for the very first time, as well as still supporting the original group and people like that original group, the artists, entrepreneurs that are doing it on their own.
Let's talk a little bit about this educational content. What kind of classes are offered?
The makerspace kind of breaks down into different departments, and each department has a shop lead in charge. And in general, those shop leads are available on certain days throughout the week for people if they just need help, advice, a quick tutorial on how to use a tool. But we also dive into more in-depth conversations about tool use. Safety, of course, is a big one. In certain shops is much more important. And then the different types of classes, we have leatherworking, we have screen printing, there is woodworking of lots of different kinds, whether it's turning on the lathe or, like I said, basic tool safety is super important in the wood shop. There's welding, sculpture, metalworking, there is glass blowing, stained glass, ceramics, and there are many other classes that happen seasonally throughout different times of the year.
You mentioned a little bit ago and just touched on it again too, your craft.
Mm-hmm.
Wonder if you could tell us a little bit about, I guess, define kind of what it is that you do, but then also like how did you get involved in that? As it's glass blowing, that's your primary focus, or
So glass is probably my first love, is what I started in, that took me down this path of being a full-time studio artist now. And I got into that when I came here to Mankato. I actually had a friend who was living with an individual who did lamp working, or flame work is a technical term of the type of glass blowing that I do most consistently. And that was before I was going to school. I came here to Minnesota State, Mankato, and my now wife tells me that she kind of converted me over to the dark side, and that I was constantly complaining that they get to make paintings for homework, and I have to write papers. And she kind of looked at me and said, that probably tells you something. You might want to think about coming over to the dark side. So I took an introduction to ceramics at MSU, and I quickly understood that that's what I should be doing. And I highly encourage any individual to focus their energy on things that they love doing. Don't waste a second. Work in the grind. I mean, it's achievable, and the Makerspace is here to help achieve those types of things. If you want to turn it into your full-time self-employment, it's hard. It takes discipline, but it can be done. Anybody can do it. So after I got into art, I then progressed and finished a BFA and also a Master of Arts degree in sculpture and ceramics. So my emphasis at school was those two types of things. So the different media that I work in, glass, ceramics, and metal. I was probably welding, brazing, young age, 10, 12, something like that. My dad works at the Minnetonka Dredging Company, and so he's around heavy machinery and welding and steel often enough, and so I was exposed to that as a young age as a possibility of shaping materials into tangible objects, transforming your ideas into 3 dimensions reality. So now, crafting in those different types of fields, it's really great having access to a studio that has those types of things that I can go in and play. And each day, I've kind of, as a self-employed individual, you get to shape your own schedule. But it is shaped through the Makerspace and some of the things that I volunteer to do, and also the classes that I teach, turns my week into, I get to play with clay one day, and then it switches over to metal and welding, fabricating the next day, and one more day in ceramics, and then a little bit of glass at the end of the week. And so I get to have access to those different types of things because we have the Makerspace.
Yeah, the facilities to do, I mean, the ones that you named were metal, glass, and clay. All those require some pretty substantial infrastructure that would be tough to put in your basement unless you got just the right space for it. So it's super cool that Makerspace exists to facilitate a lot of that.
And some of those things you can get by with the bare minimum, but it's limiting. You're only ever going to be making one type of thing, one size of thing, one facet of a material. So having lots of different ways to work with those materials, and then experts to kind of push you into trying new things, really can significantly change your craft and the quality, the craftsmanship of what you're making, and the variety of those things.
There's got to be something to be said for just spending time with other people involved in creative pursuits too, and kind of experimenting with those things. I'm sure that there's a lot of network effects in that regard with just like being around it and being inspired, and
Yeah.
it's really neat.
And it hopefully doesn't come off too repetitive plugging that mentality, but I have been recently in the last month, lots of members will come and approach me and be grateful for that aspect of having those, and it might have a little bit to do with some social limitations, restrictions, those types of things. People are really needing, asking for those, but still they understand and are grateful for that connection and those conversations.
Yeah, one of the things that I hear pretty consistently from artists is, or people who just make things in general, is that they really like the creative process of it and doing the work, and they just really like dread the business end of it, you know. And I think being exposed to like how that works does do a whole lot of things. I mean, to help out, because sometimes it is just kind of it's a real grind to get that stuff out there, like loading up Etsy pages or, you know, trying to figure out how you're going to market your stuff. So it's cool that you even have a storefront sometimes that's just attached to it. How often do you do the makers markets?
So this market will be our first in-person event in more than a year and a half now. And previously, we would be doing them every other month. The next scheduled Makers Market is in August, but we have some events coming up in June and July as well, some private, some public. But we are transitioning, trying to get back into some set of normalcy with the markets, and as things are changing, it was difficult to plan this year in general, because last year we had everything all penciled in and figured out, and that radically changed quickly. So we were a little more tentative this year as far as setting dates. Trying to organize those things is an undertaking, and to get them canceled and transferred and rescheduled is just more effort. So we're just trying to be smart. So hopefully we'll get back into the every other month. Our larger markets in November and December, in that gift-giving time, we're still going to try to make sure that those happen as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in-person events have been a real moving target for the last few months here, and it seems like we're back at it now. But in reference to COVID, what experience was that at the maker space? Was it having to restructure the way things work? Were people still able to come in? How'd you survive the, not being able to have people in the space necessarily at the same capacity?
At first, it was quite a shock, and we had extremely limited access just to essential personnel that it was vital for their business. So just a handful of individuals had access to the makerspace for the first couple of months until we could get some answers, which was also quite a challenge. Being what we are, a nonprofit community art studio, this gray area of where we fall under, where we're categorized when it came to COVID restrictions, was quite challenging to come up with what we were supposed to do, and we wanted to be responsible, so it took a little bit to figure out the answer.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine, like maybe a place that did like a make your own pottery, like a real like craft experience type of thing, could be entertainment that should reasonably be shut down. But like facilitating people who need to make a livelihood is a completely different thing, even if the tools in the room might be the exact same, Right. What did it end up being? How did you end up interfacing with that?
So after things started to be a little less restrictive, coming up with proper policies, distance, sanitation, mask wearing, the basic responsibilities to keep people safe. We were able to expand. So it was a slow transition of allowing our members back in until we could get all of our members allowed to come back in and use the space. And again, as a community shop, it wasn't like we had never had the policy of reserving a time or renting the entire wood shop for an afternoon or something like that. But we, as a newer organization, the few people that would come in were very respectful and understanding. So people worked around each other and shifted their own schedules, and the communication between our members was what made things less complicated on the organization to try and facilitate or coordinate those things. So it was good that people kind of took that responsibility, stepped up, and communicated with each other to keep each other distant and safe.
Yeah. Well, it's good that y'all survived. I know that a lot of places didn't do so hot over the pandemic.
And
Challenge.
a big gratitude towards our landlord, Ron Goodrich, who owns the building, for helping us out financially throughout this whole endeavor. It was another key reason why we did survive.
Yeah.
I was gonna talk about the organization of the makerspace and like what if any the community can do to support that kind of a thing, whether they want to, maybe for people who don't need to use the facilities, it's definitely an important asset to the community. And so I wonder if there's like an action that someone who just wants to support its existence could take for that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
There are a couple of ways that people can support the makerspace. The most obvious one, on our page, we have a supporting membership, which is half membership fee, and is there simply for that reason, so that people can contribute to keep that organization there for when they will need it. They will probably need it every once in a while, so it's good to have it there as a resource for Mankato itself. Also, staying in communication on our social media, or stopping into the shop every once in a while and seeing what the shop needs. Volunteering is a big part of what makes the makerspace go round and round, both physically and in donations. People will donate monetarily or also objects. Sometimes they'll go out and buy us a couple gallons of wood glue or paper towels or tape. Can never have enough tape or clamps. So purchasing objects, the consumables that we need, and donating them, as well as tools and equipment. I hesitate to give a number, but most of our tools and equipment have all been donated or are on loan. Like objects belong to staff or members, and they leave them at the makerspace for everyone to use. I have a couple of welders down there. I think about some of the pottery wheels belong to members, and again, that's that space kind of relationship. They don't have room in their homes to keep those things, so they leave it at the makerspace. It's always there for them when they need to use it, and then it expands our ability to facilitate, to teach people. We can have more students, more classes, more spread out, those types, when we have extra equipment. So donations are welcome, but communicating with the shop is important too, as far as donations go. And then volunteering, there is all kinds of things that can be done. Basic maintenance of cleaning, it always needs to be clean. We're a volunteer staff, so I can't emphasize that how grateful and appreciative we are when people come in just to clean. Otherwise, there are shop projects that always need to be done, improvements. I talk about the evolution of the makerspace, and we've got grand ideas, and we just need the time and the assistance sometimes to create those objects. We've got some cool tools that would be really nice to have in the ceramics department or the metal shop, and I just need the time or an extra pair of hands to help me build some of those things.
Well, so with the maker market coming up, is that a good way for people to kind of check it out, see what's going on, check the space out?
Definitely a great way. It's an open house. Not only will you be able to see and be inspired by some of the things that get made, and potentially transforming your ideas of how you could make something, developing relationships with those individuals. A lot of them are our instructors that teach classes, as well as an open house for the makerspace. You'll be able to walk through the shop and see the different departments, and a few of them will be doing demonstrations. I know that there should be wheel throwing, so you'll get to see some pots being thrown and made. There will be some wood demonstrations. Either Tyler will be there talking about the shop, or Don might be there turning some things on the lathe. And I myself will be doing glassblowing demonstrations. So you get to see the torch and hot glass being spun, moved around, and shaped into sculptures.
That's cool. That was always one of my favorite parts about going to a place like the Renaissance Festival or something. Just being able to see people crafting stuff is kind of magical.
Yeah.
It's just amazing what people can do with, I guess, in the case of glass, like molten glass and the heat source.
You've got a liquid material that is glowing in front of you in one's hands that might be 2,000 degrees plus, and it's right next to you in proximity with your body, and that liquid is being turned and spun and counteracting gravity. It's a wild thing. It's a wild thing to watch. It's definitely a mesmerizing experience, but to feel it is a whole nother level. And obviously I'm biased, but I highly encourage individuals to try glassworking if you've never tried it. There's nothing else that feels like hot glass. It's this like structure that doesn't seem to know what it is, or you aren't familiar with how it's going to be, because it's changing. It's always changing. That's a consistent thing. Even when it's static, there's still gravity being acted upon it. It's this like super cooled liquid in a static form, like a window pane. You'll often see old buildings, the panes are warped because gravity is pulling on them. But when you're working with it, when it's hot, you've got this transformation that's happening in front of you of this object that was stiff that then becomes liquid and then gets shaped and transformed, and then it goes right back to being static again in a matter of seconds. And that change of state back and forth is just one of the ways that glass is always changing.
A person who is looking to maybe just try out glass work for the first time, what kind of experience could they expect? What would they... Is it like skydiving where you have to like have someone pull the cord a few times for you, or is it...
Maybe not quite as intense as that, and maybe figuratively we're speaking that I might be pulling the cord every once in a while, but when I do glassblowing class, they are small classes so that you get the one-on-one attention that is necessary, that they deserve, and is safe. And with lamp working, torch work, I find it a lot more approachable. There's not as much heat involved, say, in comparison with offhand glass blowing, where you're in front of a furnace or you have to dip into a crucible of liquid glass. It's not quite as physical. The scale is a little bit more small, so a little more approachable. And then the type of glass that I use, Borosilicate, is hard glass, is a stiff glass. Pyrex is a brand name of Borosilicate. So individually probably have cooking vessels so they know how tough it is. It's thermal resistant, is shock resistant, but that quality also lends to some of its working habits, and it takes quite a lot of energy to heat that type of glass up, but its working window is rather small, so things don't get loose and out of control. A lot of times with soft glass, things can get so liquid that they just run right off the blowpipe onto the floor. It happens, but with borosilicate, you have maybe a little bit more time to understand and learn. But when I have individuals starting off on torch work, I always give a safety conversation. We do a demonstration of the processes that we're going to be operating. And then I have two different classes, the clear creation and the color creation.
When you're planning a larger sculpture, how do you account for like I imagine like an architect building something like a building. Like as you make structural decisions for how these things will stand or work, like what is the process like for that?
So how I described glass always changing, always moving, you have a procedure in mind of the more complicated bits, and the pre-assembly of those bits get prepped ahead of time. So if I needed a larger billet, let's say, of a certain color that I needed layers or diluted, I would make that chunk first and then set it aside before I shape it into anything. So all of my colors, so to speak, are mixed, and then they are pre-formed, depending on the scale of the object. And then the process, oftentimes, because you're working with a liquid, you have to think about how you want to move that liquid into its final form as you're shaping that billet. And then the glass, conveniently, you can additive, reductive techniques when it is applied appropriately with the right amount of heat, fully bonds and becomes one object. So you can have all these separate parts and then assemble them at the end. So
I always imagined that it was like spot welded almost, like you put a piece of molten glass in between, but you can just kind of connect them with heat.
And lamp working techniques and offhand techniques differ in assembly of processes. For when you think about like the spot welding metaphor, when you're working offhand, you'll have what they call glue bits, where certain sections of glass that you can pull from the furnace, and that gets added to one section, and then the next section joins. So it's almost like glue in between, even though they are fusing together. And it's their kind of thermal heat that is generated that binds them together, that initial connection. Then they go back into the furnace to be equalized so that everything is about the same temperature. With flame working, you can add things, you can stack things on top of each other without a glue bit, and you can really fully fuse because you have that flame in front of you. And there are lots of different styles of torches too. Hand torches are really handy when you're making sculptures, so that you can take the flame and direct it all the way around that section, so those two pieces that are being joined are fully fused and there is no seam there left in question. So it is a little bit like you're welding them together.
Because I had imagined with a larger piece of glass that there would be like how you could make two objects that were you could heat it up around the entire width of the object without some of it just being there or it being cold in the center. But that makes sense. When we were talking earlier about how you like got into all of this sculpture, in general, you said you started with clay at the university. What was it that actually got you into glass as your primary?
So glass was something that I touched on first. Just as a craftsperson, it was something that was this material that I knew nothing about. And when I had that access, that individual that still lives here in Mankato, seeing it and seeing the tools that were necessary and just living in that shop, I gain a lot just from observation. So I would just sit and watch him spin, blow glass in the garage for months. It seemed like I would just hang out there, and that exposure and also the mystery behind it. For me, I think of glass as this intersection between art and science. You have some of these technical aspects of glass blowing that is required, basic knowledge of chemistry, physics, thermodynamics, how things are moving when you can't touch them, how you would shape, and tool use, dexterity, those types of physical things of technique. But then also the mindset of that you need to be like the glass in that you're changing as it changes. The decisions need to be made in the moment, and you need to allow them to happen and be okay with whatever happens. Sometimes disaster strikes, and if you learn not to panic and be a little bit more flexible and come up with, well, how can I fix this problem, this crack, or these things did not go together correctly, or it's not the shape that I want it, how can I do it differently? You can't necessarily just set it aside and come back to that painting another day. The glass is hot. You got to keep working with it while it's hot. And so having that mentality of being flexible and patient, but also deliberate. And you have to make those decisions in the moment and stick with them and go with it, and try to make something happen out of that mistake. I kind of hesitate and use that word, but we don't make mistakes, only happy accidents. Have those serendipitous moments. And glass is so beautiful in that aspect of the serendipity of some of the colors and the chemistry. I had talked about the glass will react inside of the flame. So depending on the balance of oxygen and fuel, if you have a more reducing atmosphere, a more neutral, or a more oxidizing atmosphere, the glass is going to react to that. Some of them react detrimentally. The things can fog over, turn gray, turn brown. Other things can be magical, where metal will come up to the surface and dance across the surface of the glass, create iridescent or metallic or little pockets or bursts of different shifts in color. So understanding a little bit of what's happening chemically, and then that reaction of how can I make that work to my advantage. You're kind of going back and forth in your thoughts of technique and then craft, creation, inspiration.
That was actually another thing that I was wondering was, what does the raw material look like? Because I for some reason I think that glass is made of sand. Like, do you have a bucket of sand that you're working from?
In essence, you're not wrong. But a lot of glass makers do not batch their own glass. The energy required to transform that raw silica into glass is substantial amount of time and fuel. Silica melts at like 3,200 degrees, somewhere around there. It's a ton of energies, degrees Fahrenheit. But if you add certain fluxes, which often happen to be your colorants, and if you add glass, it's already glass, to that pure silica, it lowers that melting temperature substantially more into the 2,000 degree range. So oftentimes artists, they will purchase glass that's already been batched from manufacturers that have that technical aspect of creating that material down to a science, a perfected craft. It helps for consistency.
It's like a brick?
So when I order glass for lamp working, it comes in rods and tubes of varying sizes and colors and concentrations. So they're all linear tubes. The color comes in about foot-long sections, about 4 to 6 millimeters. Sometimes it comes in tubes. And then the clear glass rods and tubes come in about 5-foot sections, so that you then can break them down into workable sizes. So that's a lot of the preparation that happens with lamp working, is you're taking these larger manufactured structures and breaking them down into blanks that then you can transform into the objects you're going to create.
What were the ancient practices like? Like when was glass accessible? To me, it sounds like you'd need some kind of like Bronze Age. People started having glass.
Egyptians had glass, and that was actually one of the more coveted things. Having these materials that were workable, that had that vibrancy and color. Previously using stones and how hard that material is to shape and sculpt and facet, glass is quite a bit softer, maybe comparably to certain minerals. So yeah, Egyptian had access to glass, and really it transformed in the Renaissance period. That the Venetian started transforming it from material into an art form, or a functional object. Creating vessels often was the want for holding liquids and moving and transporting goods in a sanitary vessel. So that's when glass really became accessible in some ways to the world.
That's wild. I didn't know that the Egyptians had glass at all. That's kind of an interesting tidbit there. One of my final questions for you that I've got, I think, is whether there's any glass projects you're either working on now or planning for or have done recently that you're excited about, that's like a fun new process or interesting way of doing things?
So one thing that I am pretty excited is that this year I just purchased a large expansion to my color palette and some different types of colors. So I have some UV reactive, some new striking colors. There's a term where the glass will transform or transition from one color to another, sometimes dramatically. And this is a chemical thing that happens in the heat. It might shift from, I've got one color, a green, that'll shift from a blue into a nice emerald green is usually where it sits. That's its happy zone. And then you can actually strike it into an opaque kind of lime green and then vary between the three. So one piece of glass, one color, can be many different colors. And then the last variety that I have is fluorescent reactive glass. And it literally changes colors depending on the type of light. And this is something that happens when it is a cold static object. The chemistry is fixed so that the light that passes through it, the transmitted light, will refract in a different way depending on the kind of light. So, and these are new generation glass. The previous or first generation, they would do a shift that was maybe a really light tone into more of a more vibrant tone of a particular color. Now the new gen glass will shift colors. So I'll have one that goes from like a golden color, kind of an amber or champagne in natural or LEDs, but then when you bring it next to a fluorescent or a compact fluorescent, it'll shift to purple or magenta. They'll go from green to purple. They'll go from pink to orange. So it's a dramatic shift. And they're really fun to play with as a creator. And then thinking about glass in general, That is one thing that is unique to that material is the interaction of light. You are dealing with translucencies, reflective, and transparencies. So being able to have another aspect of the material to shape and play with light is really exciting for me. I think about different types of jewelry that shift in one type of light or another, or I think about sculpture of some kind that can have a particular color palette in one light, and then that palette shifts into another. So I can play with some of the fixed colors, and then how the piece appears or feels in a whole nother set, a whole nother palette of colors.
It's very interesting because, like, coming into this conversation, I would have not thought that there had been new technologies. Like, there's like a bleeding edge of glass blowing technology, or like, you know, that something new was even being created in that way. Because for some reason, I kind of think of it as an old practice.
And historically, you're right, and that is a wide perception. In the last 50 years or more, lamp working, torch work here in America and around the world has inspired a lot of new technologies. But glass in industry is used all over the place in things that maybe you might not expect. And another thought about that is there are hundreds of different kinds of glass. I don't mean colors, I mean like the chemistry and the working habits of it. I talked a little bit about borosilicate being a hard type of glass, and they have different limitations, like in manufacturing when they're trying to create like just as simple as like a beer bottle. They need that to get hot enough to be shaped into a mold and blown out, but then it needs to set up and not move around as it goes down the conveyor belt as it cools down. So it's like we need to develop a certain type of glass that will be quite liquidy to make a nice form, but then set up in seconds. And so they're still working on different types of technologies. And different types of reflective glass. I mean, glass is used in like reflectors when you're driving down the road. The signs that have little tiny pieces of glass. That's what's creating a lot of that magnification, that vibrancy that your headlights. You think about the lights that we're using here in the studio and the different components. That type of glass is needing to be like halogen lights is maybe what I'm thinking of, and not these type of lights, but those bulbs need to be able to withstand the heat and not deteriorate. So there is still glass technology in lots of different ways that happens behind the scenes.
Who's pushing the envelope in a way that interests you? Like, if you were gonna nerd out about some like glass work or something, like what's the technology that makes you the most interested or excited?
Well, that's a good question. I think I have actually been kind of dialing back a little bit and less, maybe in the last 6 months or something like that, instead of expanding outward, but more going inward and honing. Some of the objects that I typically make, and I'm doing this, I've been noticing in a lot of the different materials that I work in, going back to basics and really honing and trying to amplify that craft, just functionally, structurally, visually. And it's something that appeals to me, that high level of craftsmanship. Things are much more parallel, straight, uniform, equal, all those different types of things. Because I'm having this feeling of before I expand, I kind of contract a little bit, reassess, get better at what I do, and then the next time that I do expand, things should be a little bit more smooth, compatible. It might be less fumbling around and a little bit more of making those thoughts happen.
I got one final question, I think, and we can address it if you're familiar, and if not, we can just gloss right on over it.
Mm-hmm.
Glass right on over it. But I'm curious about the glass and its recycling characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know about that? My understanding is that it's significantly more recyclable than plastic. And my theory then is that makes it a good material to make stuff out of, I guess, as long as it's not single use.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if you know more about either it's just characteristics that make it recyclable, or the process by which it is recycled, so that people can kind of have a better understanding of that.
I'm not fully aware of how industry is recycling their materials, but in general, I could comment on how the material itself and how I use it in those type of recycling processes, which should be fairly consistent. So once glass is made, it's always going to be glass. It's never going to transform or degrade. I mean, there is a slow degradation that happens of the glass, but for the most part, once it's glass, it is that. It can be crushed, and it can be used as aggregate, and it can be recycled in that aspect. And then in certain circumstances, when I'm working with it as a material, if you treat it appropriately, it can be reheated and refused many times. There is a point in which all the flux in the glass will burn out, and it'll become too stiff. It'll go back into a crystalline state and no longer be glass. It'll be more like a stone or a mineral. But that takes quite a lot of energy abuse of the material before all those flux burn out. So it can be reused and remelted many times. And so that's kind of like a pro-con. This material that's really not going to disappear, is not going to biodegrade, versus the pro would be that it can be reused many times over.
I was actually thinking about that when we were talking about the beer bottle thing, because I always assumed that when they gather all of that it's melted down. And then I was thinking about how much energy that actually takes, like, is it, how efficient is it to reform all of that? Because they don't just wash the bottles and then remake them and reuse them. They do melt them down, right?
I hesitate in answering that because I'm not 100%, but I think they wash the bottles and reuse them.
In some countries they do, for sure.
That?
Well, in some countries you'll go to the restaurant and they'll have, like, on the steps they'll have like a plastic crate with all the bottles, the empty bottles in it. Mm-hmm. And so I think there are places that have more efficient recycling with washing, but I guess I don't know how that works in good old Americas or around here.
Yeah.
And small breweries, they want their bottles back, and they will pay to receive their bottles back, and that lends me to believe that they're cleaning, washing, and reusing those bottles, which is much more energy conscious. And it's consistent with their branding. It's their exact same bottles, so it makes sense that they go back to the source and get reused.
Maybe that's why they have the return to specific state kind of thing, because they have the infrastructure to recycle that type of bottle. I don't know. Now I'm just making shit up over here.
I've just recently been really terrified by, like, just how much domestic beer exists. Like, it's like you can walk in anywhere and be upset about not getting a Bud Light. So I'm like, what? Like, they couldn't possibly be washing those bottles. Like, I refuse to believe that. And I hope that it's true and that they are, but...
And you think about how they have to arrive back. They're getting tossed around in cans and transportation, and things are getting chipped. And how can they ensure that there's no glass chips or shards or things like that? So, in a lot of aspects, maybe they are melting the bottles down.
Interesting.
Further research.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm gonna probably sign up for a glass blowing class, because that sounds really cool. But where can people find the makerspace? Also, it started raining really loud, so apologize if that's coming through. But where can people find either your work or the Makerspace? Let's do plugs and wrap it up.
You can find my information, Flame in Hand. I have Facebook, Etsy, Instagram, and that's 3 words, Flame in Hand, usually all one continuous letter thread. And you can find things about the Mankato Makerspace at mankatomakerspace.org. There will be events and classes listed on our main page, as well as you can sign up and register. Look for different types of classes that you might be interested in. If you already know what you're after, you can go into our calendar and click on one of those and find out all about it and register for your tickets right there on the Mankato Makerspace website.
Well, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast, and I appreciate your I feel like I learned a lot about glass, actually. So that was super cool.
Thanks for having me.
Right on. And one last date and time for that the upcoming show.
The Makers Market
Yes.
is on the 23rd, Sunday the 23rd. So very soon. The times are 11 to 5.
Okay. Well, we would encourage everyone to go check it out and check out the Makerspace. All right. Thank you.
Looks like it's going to hail.
Yeah, I'm going to